This slideshow will look at the basic geography of the United States of America. The United States of America is found in the northern hemisphere and the western hemisphere of the world. And the northern hemisphere means that it is above the equator. It's in the top half of the Earth. And it's also found between two oceans. It's found between the Pacific Ocean over here to the west and the Atlantic Ocean over here to the east. It is the third largest country in the world. It's about half the size of Russia, just so you have a good comparison, with Russia being the first largest country in the world and Canada being second. United States comes in at third. We have 50 states. It's separated into 50 different states. And these 50 states include the lower 48 that we see pictured in this map here. And then there also are Alaska and Hawaii. And so these states that are pictured in this map, the map that we usually see of the US, they have a few different names. Sometimes they're called the contiguous United States. Sometimes they're called the continental United States. Sometimes they're called the lower 48. These are all the term just for these 48 states that are shown here. The other two states are Alaska and Hawaii. Now, as we look at the geographic regions, you're going to need to be filling these out on your map, and so I'll be drawing them on this small map up to the top here. And you should also be drawing and labeling them on your map. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the Central Plains. The Central Plains is where most of the crops are grown, and this is where most of our farmland exists, and that farmland exists in this middle region. You can see it's kind of the dark green. It's the lower land region of the United States. And then over in the eastern part of the United States is the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, and they kind of run right down here, and you'll be drawing these into your map, and you'll be labeling them as the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so Appalachian Mountains, let's call Central Plains number 1, Appalachian Mountains number 2. Okay, and we can put those numbers right here, number 1 and number 2 is on these mountains. Okay, and so those mountains run all the way from Georgia up to Maine, and they're low and weathered mountains, which means that they're basically just like giant hills. They're rounded on the top, they're covered in trees, not super rocky. Whereas the Rocky Mountains exist out on this side. They're on the west side of the Central Plains, and they're a much larger set of mountains. So you kind of need to draw quite a few mountains in here, and they run all the way from Mexico all the way up through to Alaska. As a matter of fact, they go all the way through Canada as well. And so this happens, or these are running in the western US, and again, the name for those is the Rocky Mountains. So we'll say 3 right here, and we'll label it as number 3 on the map. And then on your map, you're also going to include 2 other mountain ranges, and one of them is down here on the very west side, just in California. Okay, and those are the Sierra Nevada Mountains, and Sierra Nevada Mountains are right here, number 4. They look a lot like those Rocky Mountains, and so the thing about these mountains is they're sharp, and they're made out of rocks, and they're really high, and so they're fairly new mountains. They don't have that old style weathered look to them. So if we look at the 2 different types of mountains, these are the sharp ones right here, this picture, and then this picture down here is more of the Appalachian type, big hills covered in trees. But we need our 5th region on here, and our 5th region is going to be a set of mountains up here in Washington, and this set of mountains is known as, and I'm going to write it on the top of the slide, known as the Cascade Mountains. And so make sure that you understand kind of what each of these areas are and where they show up on a map. Okay, so if this is number 5, then this is number 5 right here. Make sure your entire map is labeled. Now, there are many, many rivers in America, and we definitely need to figure out how can we memorize the most important ones. This is a map of all the rivers in America, but of course we can't possibly know all of these. So we are going to learn about and label on your river map that's also in your notes. We're going to label 10 different rivers. And so I'm going to slowly do these one at a time, and then I'll erase them off the map after I've looked at them. So if you need to write them onto your map, you should pause the video for that. Okay, so the first river that we're going to talk about is the Mississippi River. Mississippi is how you spell Mississippi, and then river is spelled like you know it's spelled. Okay, and the Mississippi River is this one. It starts up here and it flows its way down all the way down to New Orleans. Okay, and so that is the Mississippi River. The next river that we are going to look at is the Missouri River, and the Missouri River flows into the Mississippi. It's a tributary, but it starts way up here. Okay, it flows its way down through. Make sure you're labeling these on the map, and that is the Missouri. S-S-O-U-R-I, Missouri River. So, M-I-S-S-O-U-R-I, Missouri River. The next one that we're going to look at, and we'll just kind of move right down through it, is it goes into the Missouri River. It's a very short one, and it's the top one that's running into the Missouri River, and that is called the Platte River. P-L-A-T-T-E River. Right, and the next one that we're going to look at is right below the Platte River. We have, running right here, the Arkansas River. And I'll quickly write that out here. The Arkansas River, and the way that I know or remember this one all the time is by looking, and you can see in the middle of this river there's a little arc. There's a little bump that goes up, and that is what helps me remember. Well, arc is for Arkansas River. The next one down right in line is right here, and this is called the Red River. So make sure you label that as the Red River. And continuing to move down, the next one starts right here and it goes all along the bottom border of Texas. And this one is not called, it doesn't end in river because it actually starts with river. It is a Spanish way of saying it. It is the Rio Grande. So that essentially means big river in Spanish. Then from the Mississippi River, we are going to move to the east this time. And we'll start right here and move up to the end of this river. And this river is the Ohio River. Okay. And then also, now we're going to move on to the kind of the west side of the country and where the Grand Canyon is. And we're going to look at this river that starts right here. It looks like it's almost connected to the Platte and runs all the way down here. And that is called the Colorado River. And after the Colorado River, we'll look at this very small river out in California, the one that goes up instead of the one that goes down, and that is called the Sacramento River. And last but not least, we're looking at the one in Alaska, and the one in Alaska is called the Yukon River. So make sure all 10 of those rivers are labeled on your map. Now we can look at the Great Lakes and try and get those labeled, which there also should be space on if you go back to the map with all of your physical features on it, like the Rocky Mountains and things like that. You should see the Great Lakes sitting right up there, kind of just to the right of Minnesota, up top of Wisconsin and Michigan and those states. And so the Great Lakes are Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. And there's a couple of ways to remember these, and I kind of will tell you both of the tricks, but the one that I learned in school was in order to do them from west to east, as long as you remember the acronym or the mnemonic device, Sally made Harry eat onions, then you will always remember the order of the Great Lakes. And if you think about it, Sally, Lake Superior, made, Lake Michigan, Harry, Lake Huron, eat, Lake Erie, onions, Lake Ontario. And the other way that you can remember it, that I was told by one of my students in like my first year here at Higher Ground, is show me. If you remember, show me the Great Lakes. As long as you remember what it looks like, you can see that right here, the top ones go in the order of show, S-H-O, and then the bottom two go in the order of M-E, show me. So those are a couple of different devices for remembering the order of the Great Lakes. Now we've been talking a lot about location and about place, and now we need to talk a little bit about movement. And so the best way to move stuff is through the water. And if you're moving it on the water, you can move it, you can move the most amount at one time. Even though it may not be the fastest way, you can move way more than double what an airplane can move. And so it's always through history been the best way to move stuff from place to place. And so naturally the towns pop up on the water. And so the first cities in America started out on the coasts. They started out on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, so that they were by the ocean. And then slowly as they started to discover the rivers, these towns that were on the rivers started to turn into big cities. Cities like Cincinnati, and which is on the Ohio River, Albany, which is on the Hudson River, New Orleans on the Mississippi River, and then St. Louis is right where the Mississippi and the Missouri River meet each other. All right, for the last map on your notes, I want you to look at it and break it down into the regions that I talk about. And the best way of doing it is to kind of set yourself up a legend of what color each one is and try and color each region as a different color. Then it's the easiest way to kind of see what they look like. And so I'm going to start out by drawing the lines in here in black, just kind of the border lines of the regions. Okay, and then I will add color as I want you to. And so we move right up here. Whoops, got a little sloppy there. But I think you can get essentially what's happening here. And then this is where I probably should make it a little bit smaller, because if you go out here, you cut off Delaware, and you include Delaware in the south, but New Jersey and Pennsylvania are both in the northeast. And so if I want the west to be purple, then what I'm going to do is this area, which is the west, I'm going to color in purple. Okay, and if I want orange to be the Midwest, I'm going to color in these 12 states as the Midwest. And if I want the Northeast to be green, I'll color in these 9 states of the Northeast as green. And then the South, in my example, will be yellow. And so I'll color in this largest area of 16 states as yellow. When you look at the West and it says 13 states, you can't see them all here. But both Hawaii and Alaska would be included in the West as well. As you no doubt remember, climate is not the temperature and precipitation right now, but it's an average. It's what it should usually be at this time of the year, because you take an average of over a very long time of what the weather was. And so the average climate is, we have a temperate climate here basically in most of America. And a temperate climate means that we have warm summers, we have cool winters, but we don't have really super extreme temperatures in most of the places that America exists. We're kind of in that perfect zone of latitude where we're not too hot, not too cold. And so Even though in the northern part it's colder and in the southern part it's warmer, it's basically all temperate. In the U.S. though, it's such a big country and it's kind of spread out with including Hawaii and Alaska, that there are actually 10 different climate zones in the United States. And it goes all the way from tundra in Alaska to tropical wet climate in Hawaii. Now, to talk a little bit more about weather type things, we need to talk about the wind patterns and the prevailing winds. The prevailing winds in America, and prevailing winds are everywhere. They're winds that almost always blow in the same direction, and that's true of America just like it is anywhere else. But they are called the westerlies, and so they run from the west coast to the east coast. They start in the west and they move to the east. And as they're moving across the country, they're carrying with it the warmth or the cold. And what happens in the winter is the winds come in from the north up here, and that cold air comes in, and then it's blown across the country, which creates the cold weather that we see in the winter. In the summer, however, the air kind of rotates up through the Atlantic and through the Gulf of Mexico into the country. And that warm air that's coming up from the tropics moves across and heats up our country. But in the same, with the same winds, those hurricanes that form out in the Atlantic Ocean also move in, usually through this region, because those winds are bringing them in that way. So we do have some weather in America that's difficult to live in, and one really, really good example of it is Minnesota, and especially northern Minnesota, where it's quite a bit colder. And so the question is, why do people live in this really hard weather? And if we look at Minnesota as an example, we can see some of the resources that Minnesota has that makes people want to live there. Okay, water, tons of fresh water here and tons of water to move goods on. So you can move on the Mississippi all the way down to New Orleans. You can move on the Great Lakes out of Canada. There's all kinds of different ways to move goods and people. There's also other resources like wood and metals. There's tons of trees around here, and there's this stuff down here, which is taconite, which is the kind of thing that you make iron ore and eventually steel out of. Okay, and so all of these resources support businesses that we want in the area. So the water is good, and everything else really supports the farming and the fishing, and then the building industry is supported by both the metal production and the wood production. America also produces a lot of fossil fuels for energy, and some of the examples of places where they are is in Texas. There's a very big oil industry. In Wyoming, there's a huge coal industry, as well as other places. And in Alaska, there's a ton of natural gas being produced. All of these resources include this, or create this huge economic growth. So our economy is growing, and our economy is growing in those three areas as well as in the country in general because of these resources. So like I said before, our very first cities were found on the coast of the Atlantic and the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, because they wanted to be able to trade with Europe, and the ocean was the best way to make that happen. And then cities started to grow based on their resources and their other location. One example is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a huge steel industry city. That's why the NFL football team is called the Steelers, after the steel industry, not after people that steal money or something like that. And so it was a really big one because it had all the resources you needed to make steel. It had coal and iron, and Pittsburgh is at the confluence, so where they come together, of three different major rivers, which went out into areas where you could ship your steel to. Then after that happened on those river cities, the railroads and canals started to open up the rest of the United States for settlement. And so cities were able to be spread more evenly throughout all of America. And we'll talk about what canals are on the next slide. So canals are man-made rivers that connect major waterways. They connect two major waterways. And so the whole idea is we're going to open up, by building our own river and digging our own river, we're going to open up these new routes for us to trade on. And the Erie Canal itself connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast through New York City. So it was an extremely important place, an extremely important canal to be built so that we could trade through one of our major trading cities in New York. And the only way that we could do this, we could make this work because the elevation changed, it got much higher, is to have locks. And we learned about locks last year, but if you remember, this picture of a lock is right here. What happens is it's basically an elevator, a water elevator for ships, and so the ship will come in here, and the water level that is seen right here will lower all the way down to the level that the ship is on, and the ship will go in there, the doors will close behind it, and they'll fill it up with water up to the level where the rest of the water is. And so instead of having to try and drive a boat up a waterfall, they can just move up this little water elevator. So to continue with the theme of movement, we'll talk a little about immigration and how it happened throughout American history. And in the 1700s, it was mostly, the biggest part of immigration was slaves that were brought in from Africa. So it was like a forced migration. It wasn't really a choice for them to migrate in. And then going into the 1800s and the 1900s, it changed to white people. It changed to a lot of white people coming in. Coming from Europe, from countries like Germany, Italy, Ireland, and a bunch of other countries as well. Those were just some of the really big ones. And the reason that they came over here was, depending on their country, some of them had a lot of push factors. So things that they didn't like about their country that was pushing them out of their country. And then that added in with the pull factor of America and the freedoms that we had, as well as the jobs that were available here. Really brought those immigrants from their European countries into America. And one of the main pull factors was there were jobs available over here, and those jobs were found in the cities. And so these immigrants often found themselves trying to head to a city in America. So throughout our history, people have been moving to cities, and they've slowly been moving away from the rural areas, away from the farms, into cities. And so the population of the United States is about 304 million people, approximately. It changes constantly, but as far as that or the percentage of that, the percentage living in urban areas in cities is about 80% of the people in America. And they live in usually these big metropolitan areas where there are a whole bunch of cities which are really close together. And so one example of a metropolitan area is the Twin Cities area that we live in right now. Minneapolis and St. Paul, of course, are the biggest cities, but when you think about it, there's a ton of cities around here. There's Roseville and Eagan and Edina and Woodbury, and all these are all close enough to be part of the same metropolitan area. So that's what a metropolitan area is. It's a group of cities that are close enough together to be kind of the same area. And if enough of these cities are close together and take up a big enough space, they can be called a megalopolis. And we have a huge megalopolis out with New York City kind of in the middle of it, and it runs all the way from up here in small parts of New Hampshire all the way down into Virginia, past Maryland, past Delaware. And so if you look at it, this is basically an idea of there's not a whole lot of country area without cities around it. And so if we look at some of these states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Delaware, are basically all city. The entire state is basically part of this one gigantic city that is a combination of a whole bunch of cities put together. And the last thing we're going to look at is the environment and effects that we have on the environment. And there's a couple of big effects that are on the environment that America has kind of done throughout their history, and one of the big ones is air pollution. And we've caused a lot of air pollution through some of the things we did in the beginning of our country, using up these raw materials. So mining and burning coal has put tons and tons of air pollution into the air, which has caused it to be less breathable and have global warming and many other issues. Now, the second issue that we have is water pollution as well, and a lot of that was the coal industry as well. Some of that was being dumped into and filtered into the water, as well as kind of just industrial waste, which means our factories, any of the waste from there. Throughout history, a lot of it was just dumped into the rivers, and so that was kind of a problem as well. And this big amount of pollution brought the fish population down, and the scientists have been working to try and reverse this. Now, the human population also increased, and it's gotten bigger over time, and so we take up more land and take up more resources, and so the number of animals and the number of plants in America is decreasing as humans are kind of taking over the continent. The last thing that also kind of goes in with all these humans and needing building materials and needing houses is deforestation, which is happening across the America. It essentially used to be one big forest. America was very, very heavily forested, and now it is not, because we've used a lot of this wood and cleared the area for our land. Okay, and so the scientists are currently working to reduce the impact that we have had, especially in our history, through these 4 major environmental concerns.